This is the Barfield Pressure Instrument Test Unit. This is used for testing the calibration of a pressure gauge, such as an oil pressure or hydraulic pressure indicator. The unit has a reservoir where oil of the appropriate variety is kept in storage and used for the test, a fill port with a vent, the plunger screw handle, which is drawn out to draw oil from the reservoir into the plunger and pressurize the line, as well as return the oil from the line to the reservoir. There is a calibrated master gauge for comparing against the gauge under test. There is a selector valve for determining where the fluid is coming from or going to. And there is the connector hose with a variety of adapters for connecting up to any pressure instrument. The selector valve is arrow-shaped. When it's pointed towards the reservoir, the flow will be into or out of the reservoir. When it is reversed and pointed towards the hose, the flow will be into or out of the hose. The flow we're speaking of is going through the plunger from the reservoir or from the plunger into the hose and vice versa. Before you start, you want to make sure that the plunger is all the way in and the valve is pointing towards the reservoir. The master gauge is calibrated in 5 psi increments, starting at 10 psi. There are arrow indicators every 25 psi to help you determine what your pressure is. The pressure hose, or connector hose, connects directly to the gauge to be tested. For purposes of this demonstration, we will be connecting to the line from the engine to the gauge. Before you start, you should ensure you have the proper amount of fluid in the reservoir. Remove the fill plug with the vent hole and physically look inside to determine the amount of fluid inside. It should be no more than 3/8 of an inch below the top and no less than about 1/4 inch below the top. When I say top, I mean the bottom level of the threads, not the top of the container. Also, make sure that the drain or the vent hole is clear. To operate the plunger, you simply turn it counterclockwise until it has come all the way out to its farthest stop. This will be about 8 inches or so. While you are doing this and the arrow is pointed, the selector valve arrow is pointed at the reservoir, you are drawing back a plunger inside the brass tube, which is creating a negative pressure and pulling the liquid inside the reservoir into the chamber behind the plunger. This is the liquid that will be used to pressurize and test your instrument. When you are turning the knob, do so gently. You do not need to grip it and twist hard. Just turn it gently until it stops. Once your fingers freely slide on it and it has stopped, that's all it's got to go. The tester is now prepared for use. One word of caution: never ever store this device with the plunger all the way drawn out. The Acme screw that goes in can be very easily damaged if the unit is dropped or otherwise impacted, and at that point it is useless. you'd have to replace the entire unit. Having connected the two lines, I'm now going to start to pressurize the system. However, I've left the B-nut loose just enough to allow oil to drip out when it gets there. The purpose behind this is to allow the line to be bled out of air, so there's mainly only oil in the line to the pressure gauge. This will help prevent a false reading. As oil flows, you will start to feel a pressure on the plunger. That's normal. That is just the oil under pressure. Observing a slow drip, I can tighten the line and then tighten the connections. Use 2 wrenches when you are working with this type of fitting to prevent either fitting from loosening. You only need a snug fit. The instrument under test in this example is the oil pressure gauge seen directly above the calibrated master gauge of the Barfield Tester. The line has already been purged, connected, and the aero valve is in the outwards position pointing to the hose. At this time, I'm going to start turning clockwise the plunger. After a few moments, you'll start to see the needles rise. That's indicating pressure within the units. We're going to stop at several different places and get a reading from each of the 2 instruments. You can see the needle passing the different points on the master gauge. The needle now is resting at 25 psi. Compare the master gauge to the gauge on the instrument panel. The master gauge is reading 25 psi. What is the oil pressure gauge reading? We are now increasing the pressure from the Barfield Tester to the oil pressure gauge. You might notice a little bump in the needle when it will go up and then come back down to rest. That's mainly because of air in the line compressing. Our master gauge is now reading 50 psi. What is the reading on the pressure gauge under test? Now proceeding up to 75 psi indicated on our master gauge. What is the reading on the oil pressure gauge under test? One note of caution. As you can see, the oil pressure gauge under test is only marked up to 100 psi, while the master gauge is marked up to 300 psi. Do not exceed the marked indication on the gauge under test. You can blow out the diaphragm inside and destroy the gauge. You noticed we also had a little settling. We lost a couple psi. Now we are back at 75 psi on the master gauge. I'm now taking it up to 100 psi on the gauge under test. What is the reading on the master gauge? As I bring the pressure down, I'm going to make the same stops again. First, I'm going to take it back to 100 indicated on both gauges now. Why did I choose 100 psi to stop? Turning counterclockwise will draw the plunger back and draw oil back into the chamber of the test unit. This will relieve pressure in the gauge line. I have now removed all the pressure from the test set. What is the at-rest position of the gauge under test? When you have completed using the Barfield tester, be sure to turn the selector valve so it's pointing to the reservoir. Then, turning the plunger knob clockwise, turn it completely back into the plunger body. Again, do not grip the plunger knob hard, just enough to turn it. So when it is fully seated, your fingers will slip along the outside and not cause any damage. I have cracked the line and turned the valve back towards the line to draw a little more juice back. And then I'm going to put that into the reservoir as well. This is just to get a little bit of air back in the end of the line so it does not leak. Once you have completed this test, you would reconnect your lines to their normal positions and stow your Barfield tester in the proper location. It should never be stored with the plunger all the way out. Why?